Helluva Autopsy, Chapter 1, The Body. Greetings and salutations. Alistair began his broadcast with a greeting as usual. Although the usual excitement he often held within his crackly voice seemed forced, as his tone also seemed to hold the faintest hint of hesitation. Alistair blinked his ruby eyes a few times, part of him not wanting to continue with the broadcast as he had planned. My name is Alistair Bosco, and this is my story. He forced himself to continue with a sigh that only seemed to irritate the static normally clumped within his throat. He knew Charlie was right, and that he would eventually have to get these traumatic memories off of his chest. Although he was not entirely sure where he should even begin. It was October 1933. I was on a hunting trip with my good friend Fabian Lindbeck. I still remember the smell of the dead leaves and the way my heavy coat did very little to shield my thin body from the chill of the autumn winds. I shivered as I aimed my rifle at the silhouette of what I initially thought was a deer. I fired one shot, but I missed due to my shivering. Instead of running off, the deer simply looked at me. Even began to stare at me, right into my very soul. As I slowly began to lower my rifle in confusion, I noticed the deer began to twitch and jerk about, as if it were incapable of getting its limbs to obey. I adjusted my monocle in a state of disbelief at what I was seeing. This creature was behaving far too strangely to be a deer. A feeling of dread began to overtake me, as the creature began to approach me, twitching and jerking all the while. It's you, it's me, it's us, spoke a voice like static, but only within my mind. Words I would not yet understand. I was frozen with fear, as I listened to the dried leaves crunch beneath its massive hooves with each uneven step. Hey, Al! I was startled out of my trance by a sudden hand upon my shoulder. I jumped as I spun around to see it was only Fabian. Relief soon chased away the fear I once felt at the fact that I would no longer have to face this creature alone. I don't think there's anything out here. Let's move on to another spot, Fabian suggested with a smile as I wondered if he could even see what I was seeing. I returned my attention to where the creature once stood, only to find that it had disappeared. Perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me, I thought, seeing as how we had gotten up early that morning and I was still fairly groggy. Agreed. I ended up agreeing to Fabian's proposal to move to a different area of the hunting grounds. Fabian gave a small nod in response before beginning to lead the way, but as I followed, I was unable to remove my eyes from the spot where the creature once stood, until it was no longer within my field of vision. Oh, crumbs, Max murmured in shock at the destruction that lied before him. Max was just starting out as a mortician, and already had become a witness to more than he could handle since his boss, Mr. Blitzo, had volunteered them to help clean up the mass amount of bodies that had been left behind in the aftermath of a sinkhole that had just destroyed the entirety of a small town. Mr. Blitzo merely viewed the tragedy as a business opportunity to kickstart the small funeral home business he had created with his best friend and partner, Mr. Fizzarolli. So far, Max was their first and only employee, besides them. Looks like this poor puss had a rough night, Mr. Blitzo remarked as he sneered down at the corpse of the bartender, of whom had snapped his spine over the counter. The bartender's skin had since turned a sickly shade of violet, his blood veins now visible through his decomposing skin. His nose had since been ripped from his face during the destruction of his casino, leaving a deep crimson heart-shaped hole within the center of his face. Blood had since pooled within his hands and forearms, enlarging them in an unusual manner. in an unnatural manner. Mr. Blitzo was an older African-American man with salt-and-peppered hair, spiky hair. His face and hands were splotched with patches of vitiligo, as he wore a black suit with a skull tie that everyone aside from himself seemed to find in poor taste of his profession. "I haven't seen this many bodies since that hunting cabin massacre," Max commented to no one in particular as he stared down at the corpse of a little girl of whom had been crushed by a gigantic slab of ceiling. Since her body had been more exposed to the sun, her skin was dishwater yellow due to being more decomposed than the bartender. Her bright orange hair had practically been drenched from the pool of her own blood, and that she now lifelessly lied in. She was missing her nose as well as one of her eyes, her lips having since rotted away from her teeth as maggots feasted upon her. Max had blonde, slicked-back hair that was nearly as pale as his own skin. As his own freckled skin. Like his boss, he also wore a black suit that made him match the bodies that he was usually working on. Max felt as if he were going to be sick from just the smell alone. The fact that he would not have to touch and the fact that he knew he would have to touch and later dispose of these bodies only made matters worse for the poor young man. Well, the whole town was just swallowed up by a sinkhole stronger than Verosika Mayday's whore lips, and this casino was ass-plugged right in the center of it all. Mr. Blitzo reminded his employee with a hint of sarcasm to his already irritated tone. "What is it, Looney?" Mr. Blitzo was then distracted by his pet husky snarling as she began to dig up yet another body from the mound of dirt that practically flooded what was left of the casino. There lied the pale, lifeless form of a brunette man. His body covered in fresh cuts, as an unnatural grin was permanently plastered across his countenance. He doesn't look like he's been dead for nearly as long as the others," Max was the first to notice as Looney continued to growl at the corpse as if it were a predator. "A group of gangbangers probably robbed this poor sucker and tossed his body down here to get rid of the evidence," Mr. Blitzo rationalized, more to convince himself rather than his only employee. "Well, I hope you didn't have any plans for tonight, because you're working overtime. Now help me shove all these stiffs into body bags," Mr. Blitzo demanded before turning to retrieve the body bags from his van. "Yes, sir." Max sighed in defeat, since he did in fact have plans that night. A special date with his girlfriend Millie, of whom he had planned on proposing to that night. However, he highly doubted she would say yes, since this new job ensured that he was hardly ever around. For a brief moment, Max wondered if what he initially believed to be his dream job was worth sacrificing his quality of life over, as he glanced back over at the out-of-place corpse. He shuddered, feeling unnerved by its sinister grin, before leaving to assist his boss with the cleanup. "Fabian actually managed to bag a deer on our little hunting trip. As I drove him back to his home, we talked for hours about nothing along the way. Although I could not help but feel like the eyes of that creature I saw earlier were still watching me from the shadows. Little did I know that the creature would soon become my shadow. When we arrived at Fabian's humble abode, his wife Villa was out front, awaiting our arrival, along with his 2 daughters, his eldest Luna, and his youngest of whom would soon become the bane of my existence, Minnie. As Fabian embraced his wife for a deep, passionate kiss, I felt a twinge of anger, jealousy maybe, perhaps because he had the perfect family I never nor would ever have. Yes, that had to be it. "I brought dinner," Fabian announced, with a sing-song voice once he had pulled away from his wife. He then gestured toward the deer carcass I helped him strap to the top of my truck. "Oh, wonderful." Villa forced a smile, but only I took notice of the subtle cringe she initially made. "Daddy!" Minnie was the next to greet her father by practically leaping into his arms. "There's my princess," Fabian responded by lifting his youngest daughter into the air with a chuckle. "Alistair, why don't you join us for dinner?" Oh, sorry, wrong voice. "Alistair, why don't you join us for dinner?" Villa then invited me in just as I turned to leave. "Oh, no, I wouldn't want to impose." I began to refuse the offer since being around his family made me feel uneasy for reasons I still fail to understand. Perhaps I could sense the betrayal that was to come. "You wouldn't be imposing at all. You're practically family," Fabian reassured me. "I'm family?" I asked as I could not help but feel touched by such an honor bestowed upon me by my dearest friend at the time. "Yes, and you're the best kind. You don't want my money," Fabian joked as he placed an arm around the shoulders of his unamused wife. I chuckled as I followed the family indoors. Fabian always knew how to successfully persuade me into doing what he wanted. Chapter 2, Moxie. Max let out a sigh as he stepped outside of Blitzo and Fizzarolli's funeral parlor for a breath of fresh air. His feet were throbbing from having been forced to stand all day. Pain radiated along his spine and throughout his joints. He had a massive headache, and to make matters worse, he reeked of embalming fluid. Max glared up at the full moon as it was already well past nightfall. Max heavily resented his bosses for forcing him to work so late. Mr. Blitzo especially, since he was the hardest on him. Being a mortician was no longer Max's dream job. Working for the small rundown funeral parlor was making him miserable, and he knew he would end up quitting on the spot sooner rather than later. Forcing him to cancel his big date with Millie may have just been the final nail in the metaphorical coffin he had gradually been building for this job. Max released another sigh as he glanced over at his clipboard, using the light of the parlor's inappropriate neon blinking signs to view his workload progress. They were able to identify the bartender as Husk Laurer and the little girl as Nifty Marie, as well as many other victims of the sinkhole. The only body they had yet to identify was the last corpse they had found, and also the corpse they had left to autopsy. Also the last corpse they had left to autopsy for the night. The mysterious, grinning brunette of whom they had since labeled John Doe, for the time being. Tears began to sting the brims of Max's brown eyes as he reached into his pocket to retrieve a small suede black box that held the engagement ring he had purchased for his girlfriend. He popped open the box to view the large diamond, his frustrated, tear-filled expression glaring back up at him from the flawless rock's reflection. "Gotcha!" Just then, Max was startled into nearly dropping the box by a pair of dainty hands upon his shoulders. He dropped his clipboard as he managed to catch the small box, after a bit of fumbling, quickly closing it and hiding it behind his back as he spun around to view his supposed attacker. His pounding heart began to calm upon realizing that it was only his girlfriend, Millie. "Sorry, I couldn't resist," the southern girl giggled at the beads of sweat that now coated her boyfriend's already pale face. Millie was a tan-skinned young woman with black, messy hair and a beauty mark on her left cheek. She wore heavy makeup and black overalls since she was a farm girl. "You almost scared me to tears," Max panted as he used his free hand to clutch his pounding heart. "Oh, I'm sorry, Maxie," she apologized with another giggle. "What are you doing here?" Max then asked with a small smile, since he was happy to see the one and only light he had left in his life. I missed you, so I thought I'd stop by and bring you some coffee. Millie blushed as she offered a Starbucks cup to her boyfriend, of which he eagerly accepted, since he desperately needed the caffeine. Moxie? Max then began to question the name that was written on the styrofoam cup. I'm sorry, sweetie, I told him to write Maxie on it. Millie explained with a sheepish smile her intentions to initially decorate her boyfriend's cup with the pet name she often called him. They never get my name right. They didn't even spell Moxie right. Max began to complain about his irritation with the Starbucks inability to spell his name correctly. Moxie would be a great nickname for you, Millie then pointed out with a giggle. Ugh, don't call me Moxie, it sounds like a dog's name, Max insisted before turning to pick up his clipboard. To pick his clipboard back up from the ground. Aw, but you're cute like a little old puppy, my sweet little Mox. Millie then teased as she hugged her boyfriend from behind. Max's only response was to playfully roll his eyes with a smirk. So how's work going? Millie casually inquired as Max took a small sip of his coffee. Honestly, I'm thinking about quitting, Max admitted with hesitation as he absent-mindedly swished the coffee around in his cup. But working with dead bodies is your dream job, Millie protested. Working with dead bodies is not my dream job. Comforting people is. Ever since I gave my cousin that blanket at my aunt's funeral, I knew that was what I wanted to do with my life, helping people in their time of need. But here, it just feels so cold. My bosses both treat me like their personal punching bag. This job takes up most of my time, especially away from you. And the clientele is the worst. I never knew how frugal old people could be. It's always, how much is this? How much is that? And if the price is too high, I'm too fat. It doesn't help that Mr. Blitzo keeps undermining me and slashing prices that he won't let me slash. Max began to vent to his girlfriend almost a year of emotions he kept bottled up. And my back is killing me. My spine. Aye! Max groaned before clutching his back and letting out an ear-piercing shriek that caused Millie to jump. Oh, my poor baby. You do whatever you think is right, and I'll support it, Millie reassured before beginning to rub her boyfriend's shoulders. Max smiled as he felt himself relax at his girlfriend's touch. Millie always knew exactly how to make him feel better. You know, I wanted to wait for the perfect moment, but I don't want to wait anymore. Max turned to face his confused girlfriend before pulling the small suede box out of his pocket and presenting her with the diamond ring it held within. Millie, will you marry me? Max proposed as Millie covered her mouth in shock. Oh, Maxie, yes. She practically sobbed as tears began to gush from her eyes with smearing her mascara. What do you mean you quit? You can't quit! Just as Max slipped the engagement ring onto Millie's finger, the couple's romantic moment was interrupted by Mr. Blitzo shouting at Mr. Fizzarolli, of whom was in the process of storming out. Like Mr. Blitzo and Max, Mr. Fizzarolli wore a black suit. He also had long, silky black hair that fell into 2 points past his waist. And he also had skin that was as pale as Max's. Sorry, Blitzo, but I found me a new sugar daddy, Mr. Fizzarolli bragged with a smirk. But our business is just about to take off, Mr. Blitzo argued. This pathetic little funeral home ain't going nowhere, and you know it. Especially not with the way you slash prices, Mr. Fizzarolli pointed out. I only slash prices for special cases, Mr. Blitzo anxiously responded. Every case is a special case with you, Blitzo. Every single one. Our last client was some kid prank calling us. Mr. Fizzaroli finally snapped back at his former partner. No, he wasn't. We just got disconnected. Mr. Blitzo became more nervous, knowing that he was about to lose this argument. Blitz, he literally started saying, pee-pee-poo-poo, when you asked him for his address. Face it, this funeral home is a joke, and it's a bad one, Mr. Fizzaroli pointed out, provoking his former partner to sigh in defeat as he inevitably lost the argument. Call me when you catch on, Mr. Fizzaroli cheerfully taunted before beginning to skip away. No, you call me when you need us to sew you back together after your new side piece cuts you up into pieces, Mr. Blitzo retorted as he shook his fist at his former partner. Mr. Blitzo then glared at his employee and his girlfriend upon realizing that they had just witnessed his business partner walking out on him. Fighting back tears, Mr. Blitzo swiftly turned on his heels and made his way back inside of the funeral parlor. Max and Millie exchanged unsure glances before deciding to follow the parlor's now only owner inside. Max always suspected that there may have been more between his bosses than just a business partnership, but the clear breakup he had just witnessed that night left no doubt in his mind. The moment the couple set foot inside of the funeral parlor, they were met with Looney barking and snarling at them with aggression. Looney, bad dog! Max smacked the husky's snout with his clipboard, which seemed to work as she let out a yelp before slinking away with a quiet snarl. Sorry, I swear that mangy thing gets more aggressive with age. Max apologized with a sigh before the two continued their search for Mr. Blitzo. The couple finally located him in the morgue where he was preparing the John Doe for their final autopsy of the night. Hey, come on in! Mr. Blitzo welcomed the couple in with a friendly smile as if nothing had even happened earlier. Max cringed as the urge to shield his new fiancée's eyes from the naked corpse in the room began to rise within him. That was until he took notice of the pure fascination upon his fiancée's countenance. Cool, Millie beamed, since unlike Max, she always had an obsession with the macabre. This is nothing. You should get a look at some of our other bodies. Now that is cool. Mr. Blitzo began to brag since he took pride in his own line of work. Sir, Moxie began to scold his boss for suggesting something that was so disrespectful to the dead. Can I? Millie requested, her eyes beaming with excitement. Sure, pick a cooler, any cooler. Blitz was quick to grant her permission before Max could even have a chance to protest. He then gestured toward the corpse-filled metallic coolers that lined the entire left wall of the embalming room. That one. Millie then eagerly picked a cooler at random. Max looked to his boss with pleading eyes, not wanting to expose his fiancée to such a gruesome sight. His new fiancée to such a gruesome sight. You heard the lady. Mr. Blitzo backed Millie up with a smirk as Moxie sighed and opened the cooler of Anthony Kovac. Anthony was a young man with blonde hair of whom had died from a drug overdose. A blood vessel had burst within his left eye, causing it to turn almost completely black. This ain't the cooler I picked, Millie pointed out with a small pout. There are some things you can't unsee, Max warned her with a frown of concern. Oh, come on, wrong voice. Oh, come on, Max. The lady can handle it, Mr. Blitzo insisted as he yanked open the cooler of Cheryl Bomb. Against Max's wishes, there lied a young woman with long, messy, hot pink hair and a small sheet that covered her face. Why do you tie bells around their toes? Millie then questioned upon finally taking notice of the small bells that had been tied around Cheryl and Anthony's big toes. In case either of them turn out to still be alive or some sicko tries to steal them. If these stiffs move even a little, we'll know it. Mr. Blitzo explained. Why is her face covered up? Millie then questioned with pure curiosity. This idiot blew a hole straight through her face with a cherry bomb. Mr. Blitzo explained with a tone that was far too perky for the situation. Why would someone do that to themselves? Millie cringed as she turned her attention back to the young woman's corpse. Ain't our job. Our job ain't to figure out why, sweetie. It's to figure out how. Mr. Blitzo then informed her as he folded his arms over his chest. Slowly, Millie reached for the blanket with the intention of exposing Cheryl's deformed face, when she was startled enough to scream by Max suddenly causing the bell on the corpse's toe to jingle. Maxie, you booger! Millie giggled as Max and Mr. Blitzo both burst into laughter. After all the bodies had been returned to their rightful coolers, Max led Millie back outside. I gotta go, sweetie. I'll see you when you get home, fiancé. Millie purred before caressing Max's cheeks and passionately kissing his soft lips. Mr. Blitzo watched with a glare of jealousy from the front windows as Max practically melted into the kiss. After having just lost Mr. Fizzarolli, witnessing Max's happiness stung Mr. Blitzo's cold heart quite a bit. Millie flashed her fiancé one final playful smirk before leaving. Max returned to the parlor's lobby with a love-struck smile plastered across his countenance. What? He then questioned upon noticing that his boss was still glaring at him. Just get back to work, Mr. Blitzo commanded before storming off back towards the embalming room. Max released a sigh of frustration at the fact that his boss was in another bad mood. The mysterious John Doe may have been their last autopsy for the night, but Max just knew that tonight was going to be a long night to bear. Okay, which chapter are we on? 3? Chapter 3, The Calm Before the Storm. Forgive me. My memories of the next part are a bit hazy. I remember back on Earth I had my own radio show, just like I do now, here in Hell. I, unfortunately, am unable to remember much of what it was about. Funny how Hell has a way of obscuring your positive memories whilst making sure you remember most of your negative memories in vivid detail. I remember I used to sing on that show from time to time, and that I used to interview people just like I do now. I cannot for the life of me remember any details. I recall some of what happened on the day everything went horribly wrong. The day that was the beginning of the end of my life. Fabian was a kindergarten school teacher in his lifetime. I remember that day he brought his entire class up to the radio station for a field trip, his youngest daughter included. I truly am sorry, but I am unable to remember what that day's broadcast was even about. I believe I sang a song that day, perhaps. Anywho, during the broadcast, at some point, Minnie decided to develop a crush on me. When the broadcast was over, the entire class thought it would be fun to tackle me to the ground. You know how kids are. That was when Minnie took the opportunity to kiss me on the lips with her wretched little mouth. I pulled her aside and I explained to her that it was inappropriate to kiss anyone other than her parents like that. I was truly livid. I thought that would be the end of it, but little did I know that this brat would soon be planning her revenge. As Mr. Blitzo contacted the families of the sinkhole's latest victims and made funeral arrangements, Max made himself comfortable in the break room so that he could finish off the rest of his coffee. Once Max had finished off the last of his coffee, he set his empty cup down on the table and began to text Millie since he missed her already. Max jumped when his coffee cup suddenly fell off of the table and onto the floor. Perhaps he accidentally knocked it over with his elbow, although he did not recall doing so. Max picked his coffee cup back up and placed it back upon the table, only to be startled when it had suddenly seemingly flung from the table. Max rubbed his eyes in disbelief as he mentally attempted to reassure himself that he simply missed the table due to exhaustion. He once again retrieved his cup from the floor in order to toss it into the trash before heading to the restroom. After quickly relieving himself of all the coffee he drank, Max made his way over to the sink to wash his hands before splashing some of the cold water onto his face. When Max looked back up at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he was horrified to see that his face was now bright red, his freckles white in contrast to his new complexion. His eyes were now amber and cat-like, his hair now white, bright white with striped horns sprouting from his head. Nausea overcame Max before he even had time to register his strange new appearance as he rushed over to the nearest toilet to vomit. A black tar-like substance spilled from his throat, and it held the foul stench of rotten flesh. After he finished emptying the contents of his stomach, Max stumbled back over to the mirror, only to find that his face had returned to normal. Max panted softly from relief as he reached up to feel his face in order to make sure that all was well. At least his shift would be over soon, so he could finally go home and get some rest. Max! Max then jumped upon hearing his boss bellow his name from the embalming room. Max began to mumble curses against his boss from beneath his breath before exiting the restroom and making his way back into the morgue area where Mr. Blitzo impatiently awaited his arrival. "Where the hell have you been? Time is money, Max," Mr. Blitzo demanded with a scolding tone. I just needed to use the restroom, sir," Max explained with irritation clear in his tone as he was nearing the end of his tether with his boss. "Let's just get this over with," Mr. Blitzo snapped, clearly taking the pain of losing his partner out on his last remaining employee. Mr. Blitzo then turned on his tape recorder in order to take down notes for the autopsy without having to write them down, since neither he nor Max would have any hands free to do so. Subject, John Doe, found in a sinkhole wreckage. Subject is covered in scars, none of which appear to be fresh. Other than that, subject has no clear external injuries, Mr. Blitzo stated for the recorded notes, as Max began to examine the body for any signs of broken bones. Subject appears to have shattered wrists and ankles. Rigor mortis doesn't seem to have set in yet, Max stated for the recording as he gently felt over the body's limbs and was even able to bend the body's elbows with ease. Subject appears to have paint under his nails. Max then pointed out the discovery the corpse had caked beneath its nails and its finger and toenails. The corpse even had some traces of the black substance caked within his hair. That's strange. They stopped making that kind of paint in the 1930s. Mr. Blitzo noted after further examining the substance. Max continued his examination of the corpse in spite of his confusion. Subject is male, hair color brown, eye color gray. Max was then bewildered at the sight of the body's cloudy eyes once he had forced them open. Normally, you don't see this kind of clouding until third stage decomposition, Mr. Blitzo pointed out, now equally as dumbfounded as Max with minor difficulty. Max forced open the corpse's grinning teeth with the intention of checking his dental records. Subject's tongue appears to be missing along with all of his back molars, Max then noted, growing even more uneasy and perplexed by the minute. Do you think he bit it off? Max guessed. Nope, that cut is way too clean. Someone would have had to sever it with a knife or a pair of scissors. Mr. Blitzo then explained after examining what was left of the corpse's tongue. Help me flip him over, Mr. Blitzo then instructed. Max did as told, and assisted his boss in flipping the corpse onto its stomach. Whoa, there is a lot of trauma back here, Mr. Blitzo then noted as he examined the corpse's nether regions. He doesn't really take me as the type to be into this sort of thing, Max pointed out with a small blush, since between him and Millie, Max himself was the type to be into that sort of thing. Are you kidding me? Just look at this guy. I'd totally peg him. Mr. Blitzo was then quick to point out just how attractive the dead man appeared to be. Gross, sir. Max groaned before helping his boss flip the corpse back over onto its back. Do you think he was? Max began with a sickening thought when a sickening thought crossed his mind about their John Doe. I wouldn't be surprised, but right now we can't say for sure, Mr. Blitzo reminded Max not to speculate before grabbing a scalpel from his table of equipment to make a Y incision on the body's chest. Both morticians were surprised by the amount of blood that began to practically gush from the fresh cut. Normally you don't see bleeding like that unless the subject just died, Mr. Blitzo pointed out as he collected a few pints of the blood into some small containers for later testing purposes. You have a dream, you're here to tell. It's laughable, but hey kid, what the hell? Because you're one of a kind. Both morticians were then startled by the small radio Mr. Blitzo kept in the morgue suddenly switching on by itself. A storm's picking up outside. It's probably messing with the fuses or something, Mr. Blitzo reassured, more so himself rather than Max, as both men were now visibly beginning to feel uneasy. Little did the morticians know that the crackly voice they were listening to, singing on the radio, was none other than the voice of their very own John Doe. Mr. Blitzo then returned his attention to the body in order to open up its chest cavity. I didn't take him as the type to be a smoker, Max commented on the amount of smoke damage done to the corpse's lungs. You could smoke an entire pack a day for your whole life and still wouldn't experience this type of lung damage. Normally you only see this if the subject died in a fire, Mr. Blitzo explained, perplexed by what he was seeing. But there's not a burn on him, Max pointed out as Mr. Blitzo then used his scalpel to open up the corpse's stomach. Inside of the John Doe's stomach, Mr. Blitzo found a small cloth bag that was somehow still in perfect condition in spite of the stomach acid. Well, I guess I know what happened to his tongue and teeth. I guess we know what happened to his tongue and teeth, Max remarked once Blitz had opened the bag to find the John Doe's severed tongue and missing molars. Yeesh, whoever killed this poor sucker must have really wanted him to suffer, Mr. Blitzo then commented before setting the bag aside so that he and Max could begin to remove the corpse's organs. As Max turned to put the organs in the refrigerator, he was surprised to find that blood appeared to be leaking from the bottom of the refrigerator's door and onto the floor. Sir? When Max opened the fridge, he was even more flabbergasted to see that the blood samples Mr. Blitzo had collected earlier seemed to be overflowing. Damn it, Max, what did you do? Initially, Mr. Blitzo had assumed that Max had accidentally spilled the blood samples. However, his face began to pale once he took notice of just what Max had been trying to point out. One thing's for certain, you're never getting out of here, was the final thing the voice on the radio said before all power to the building was suddenly cut off by the worsening storm outside. When Fabian invited... Chapter, 4, I think this is 4. Shadows. When Fabian invited me over to his house the following evening, I had no clue when I was about to walk into a trap. To this day, I still kick myself for not being more suspicious of the way Villa glared at me before leading those two wretched daughters of hers upstairs. "Good evening, Fabian." I greeted who I thought was my friend, as I normally did. The look he was giving me as he neglected to return my greeting just made me feel so uneasy. I still feel a sense of dread when I remember that look he held within his gaze, as I remember the words he spoke next. "Have a seat, Alistair," he sternly commanded, as if I were a child. At the time, his attempts to intimidate me were successful, so I did as instructed. Is everything okay, Fabian?" I inquired as I strived in vain not to choke on my own words. "Minnie has told me something concerning. She says she doesn't like you anymore." Fabian began, his tone as cold as ice. "Oh, and why is that?" I questioned as I secretly began to wonder if this talk were going to be about that little kissing incident that had occurred that day. "She says that you have a penis and that it sticks up like a pole." I was taken aback by what Fabian had told me next. For a good long while, I was at a loss for words. "Did you touch my little girl?" Fabian accused when I took too long to respond for his liking. No, of course not," I finally spat out. Where did this child even hear of such a thing? I wondered. Then why would she say such a thing? Fabian interrogated me further. "I don't know, Fabian. You have to believe me. I would never do anything like that to a child. You do believe me, don't you?" My heart shattered as I pleaded with my friend to not believe his wretched child's lies about me. I'm your best friend. I'm your best friend. Your brother. You've known me since we were children. I desperately attempted to remind Fabian of who I was, or at the very least, who I was supposed to be to him. Children don't lie, Alistair. With one final sentence, Fabian decided to end our friendship that had lasted since childhood. As my eyes began to burn with tears, I quickly turned to leave, so that Fabian would not be able to see me cry. Alistair. I stopped when I felt Fabian's strong hand upon my shoulder. My vision began to blur as tears finally escaped from my eyes. I could feel warm tears rolling down my cheeks, as I desperately hoped that Fabian had changed his mind and had finally decided to believe me. I was wrong. He forced me to turn around to face his angry gaze, before grabbing me by the throat and slamming me into the wall with enough force to crack it. If I ever see your face again, I will kill you, he threatened, his voice filled with hatred and malice. Fabian, I whimpered between sobs as someone I once trusted with my own life was now threatening it. It felt like an eternity before he finally released his grip on my throat, and when he did, I fled outside into the cold of the night. As I ran, fear began to sting my pounding heart, as I felt as if I were being watched. Max grumbled in frustration as he stumbled around the darkened funeral home, with nothing but a cheap, dim flashlight to illuminate his way. Mr. Blitzo had, of course, sent him to repair the blown fuse, and had lent him the cheapest flashlight he owned to do so. Ah! Ass-packing, stupid end table! Crumbs! Max cried out in pain when he had bumped his knee against one of the many small decorative tables that lined the funeral parlor's hallways. Max, you didn't break my flashlight, did you? Mr. Blitzo called out from the embalming room, much to Max's irritation. No, I just shattered my kneecap like a dinner plate, but your flashlight's A-okay. Don't worry, sir. Max reassured with minor sarcasm in his voice before heading over to the basement where the fuse box was located. Max, be careful in the basement stairs, Mr. Blitzo announced, a warning to his employee as Max pried open the old door to the basement. Oh, really? Because I thought I'd go down backwards, hopping on one foot while... Oh, crumbs! Max's second attempt at sarcasm backfired tremendously when he had accidentally tripped and began to tumble down the old rickety wooden basement stairs, swearing the entire way down until his fall was broken by something soft. Dread began to fill Max when a yelp rang out throughout the pitch-black basement along with a sickening crack. Great golly almighty! Max was horrified when the power miraculously roared back to life, and the light switched on revealing that Max had accidentally landed upon his boss's dog, snapping her neck in the process. A few months before my trial, I was arrested and thrown into prison, where horrible, unspeakable things were done to me. I still remember it so vividly. Forgive me, but I would rather not talk about my time in prison. I begged my girlfriend at the time, Mimsy, to bail me out on numerous occasions, but she did not believe me. She did not believe I was innocent either. So she refused, even after she saw my tears. Needless to say, that was the end of our relationship. I could not bring myself to forgive her after what she allowed me to go through, even after I was proven innocent. I was proven innocent by the court of law when they searched my house. When they searched the house I owned at the time and realized that my house did not have that so-called basement that Brat accused me of molesting her in. Even after my innocence had been proven, I was shunned by the entire town. The final slight that broke me was when I was fired from my own radio show, and they gave my spot to Vox Hamill, of all people. I still have never forgiven Vox for stripping me of my last remaining passion in my lifetime. I remember standing on the bridge above the lake that night, contemplating ending it all, when I heard a voice. Everybody has turned their back on you. Nobody believes you. But I know the truth. I am all you have left now. It was that same voice I heard in the woods when I saw that creature on my last hunting trip with Fabian. I looked up and saw through my tears. I could see that same creature standing by the lake shore, staring into my soul, its large red eyes glowing. Stop denying me, Alistair. Even though the creature's voice held a demanding tone, I felt comforted by its presence. It's you. It's me. It's us. I sobbed as I made a deal with the creature that I had yet to understand and stand the full gravity of. And just like that, the Wendigo became my shadow. Sir, I am so sorry, Max sincerely apologized, feeling a terrible sense of guilt, as Mr. Blitzo placed the body of his beloved dog into the cremation oven and tearfully turned it on. Naturally, Mr. Blitzo was distraught by the loss of his pet, since she truly was the only family he had left. She was more than just a dog to me, Max. She was my daughter. She was the only child I will ever have, and you had to go and crush her with your big fat ass. In a fit of grief, Mr. Blitzo, of course, blamed Max for the death of his pet, since he had been the one to fall on her. How is everything bad that happens to you somehow magically my fault? Max snapped after nearly a year of verbal abuse from his boss. Mr. Blitzo was at a loss for words, taken aback by the fact that timid little Max was finally standing up for himself. More importantly, that Max was finally standing up to him, of all people. You blame me for everything that could possibly go wrong, and I'm sick of it. After all the sacrifices I made for you, I hate you, you horrible little monster. No matter what I do, you never appreciate it. What do I have to do to get some respect around here? Chew someone's head off? As Max began to rant at his boss, he forced himself to begin walking away before he would say something that he may truly regret later. That was until he slipped in a small puddle of suspicious liquid, most likely formaldehyde, and fell flat on his bottom. That's it! Max growled as he picked himself back up from the floor. his bruised rear now soaked from the chemical substance. "Max?" Mr. Blitzo began, although his words became trapped within his throat as Max turned around to face him with a glare of pure hatred. "No, I am done. I am crispy fried done. You can't even stick a fork in me. That's because that's how done I am. Because now I'm burnt. I'm a piece of charcoal. I quit." Max finally worked up enough courage to quit his horrible job on the spot. Mr. Blitzo appeared stunned as Max turned to storm out of the room, feeling as if a dead weight had been lifted from his chest. Okay, chapter 5, I think, yeah. Criminy. Since I had been shunned by the entire town for a crime I never committed, my presence had become unwelcomed everywhere. Even the grocery store. I could still hunt for my food, sure, but for some reason, venison just was not enough to satisfy the intense hunger I too often felt. I only craved meat, but no matter how much of it I ate, I still felt so hungry, so empty. One day, there was a tiny knock at my door. A tiny knock I recognized from someone who used to help me with chores around my house. The girl who ruined my life. Minnie. Her name practically left my mouth in the form of a snarl when I answered the door to that wretched brat. "Mr. Bosco?" she squeaked, with fear as she began to back away from me, a fear that filled me with satisfaction as I towered over her. I felt like a predator about to devour its prey. I felt like a monster, but at the same time, it just felt so good to intimidate this brat. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for all the trouble I caused. I said something stupid," she admitted. So she attempted to apologize to me as I took a step closer to her. She actually thought her little apology would make everything magically go away, go back to normal, as if she never ruined my life to begin with. You think a weak little apology would just fix everything?" I growled as I remained unaware of the fact that my new shadow had slowly begun to lift a small jagged rock behind me. "Mr. Bosco, please, I said I was sorry," she begged before turning her attention to my shadow with a look of horror, all the color draining from her face. Your little white lie, ruined my life," I bellowed, when my shadow unexpectedly sent a sharp-pointed rock spiraling deep into the child's eye. "Minnie, no!" In a state of shock, I dropped to my knees and scooped up the fallen child into my arms. Fresh tears spilled from my already puffy, swollen eyes. My tears were not shed for her life, but for what was left of mine. I was glad that the brat was dead, but I knew I would be blamed for this for certain. I would be sent back to prison. I needed to think of a way to dispose of her body quickly, but I was just too starved to focus. She made a delicious gumbo, her tender meat finally satisfying my hunger for a short while, but I had some leftovers, so I left them on Fabian's doorstep along with a note claiming that the food had come from the church. The thought of my traitorous friend devouring the remains of the brat he chose over me truly filled me with a sick sense of pleasure. "Damn it, come on!" Max mumbled beneath his breath as he strived in vain to force open the funeral parlor's one and only exit door. A large tree had been blown down in front of the parlor's front door thanks to the storm, leaving Max trapped inside with his former boss. Max's resentment for his former boss began to grow even stronger for being too cheap to make sure that his own building was up to code. "Max, wait!" Mr. Blitzo shouted as he rushed to catch up to his former employee. He was relieved to discover that Max had been unable to leave the building. "Max, I'm sorry. You've been doing a great job, and I'm proud to be working with you." Mr. Blitzo finally apologized for his actions as he placed a hand of reassurance upon Max's shoulder. Mr. Blitzo was determined to not to lose another employee and let his business fall apart, even if doing so meant swallowing his pride. Max was about to tell his former boss that it was too late for apologies when he looked down at Mr. Blitzo's hand upon his shoulder and took notice of the long red claws that were now sprouting from his fingertips. Max's eyes widened as he slowly turned to face his former boss. Mr. Blitzo's face was now bright red, just like Max's reflection had been earlier in the restroom mirror. His vitiligo patch is white in contrast to his rosy complexion. His amber and cat-like eyes. He now had his eyes now amber and cat-like, my bad. His hair was completely missing as massive horns grew from his black spined head. What? Mr. Blitzo practically gasped when Max released a girlish shriek before backing away from him. Your face! Max stammered, even though Mr. Blitzo's face had returned to normal. What about it? Mr. Blitzo questioned before Max could even have a chance to respond. The two's conversation was interrupted by a familiar jingling of bells. Slowly, the two morticians turned to see the bodies of Anthony, Husk, Nifty, and Cherry all standing in the hallway. They all released a sickening moan in unison before slowly beginning to approach the two terrified morticians. Quick, my office! There's a gun in my office! Mr. Blitzo instructed before practically shoving Max into his office. Shortly after Minnie went missing, Fabian, of course, tried to get the police to investigate... I'm sorry, I didn't do his voice. Shortly after Minnie went missing, Fabian, of course, had tried to get to the police to investigate me. But they did not take his claims too seriously, after his daughter had foolishly lied in a court of law. Thankfully, I was not even arrested this time around. The Lindbeck family did not care for that, Luna especially. I know you did something to my little sister. Where is she? The girl was actually bold enough to confront me on my own doorstep. I assure you, my dear, she is safe and sound. I reassured her with a lie that was masked by my own overly perky tone. Really? Luna raised an eyebrow of suspicion at me. Would you like me to lead you to her? I offered, and the girl was actually foolish enough to follow me to my backyard. Well, where is she? I don't see her anywhere, Luna demanded as she stepped closer to the center of my yard. You'll be joining her soon, I stated in a tone of darkness I never knew I possessed, and with one wave of my hand made the earth open up beneath her, before she could even have a chance to react. The moody teenager fell 10 feet to her death, sharp, jagged sticks and rocks slicing up her body like a tenderized meat along the way. She made a delectable jambalaya that I was more than happy to share with Fabian, along with a note from the church. Mr. Blitzo trembled with fear as he curled up into the fetal position within the corner of his office. He was on the verge of tears, far too distressed to function. So Max took it upon himself to load the rifle that Mr. Blitzo kept hidden within his desk drawer. Max, no, Mr. Blitzo begged in a hushed whisper as Max unlocked the door to his office. Max stared down at Mr. Blitzo, his face twisted in concentration, as he slowly opened the door by just a crack and placed the barrel of the rifle through it. He could hear the bells jingling, and the silhouettes of the corpses began to sluggishly approach within the darkness of the hallway. But Max did not shoot until he saw the gaping hole within the center of Cherry's face. After shooting Cherry in the heart, all of the other bodies seemed to vanish into thin air. Max fully opened the office door to view the being that was now lying on the floor, desperately gasping for air. Millie! Max gasped at the sight of his fiancée choking on her own blood, a look of shock upon her countenance as she clutched the painful bullet wound within the center of her chest. When the storm had begun to worsen, Millie grew worried and had returned to the funeral home to check on Max, until she had been trapped inside by the fallen tree. When she began to search the funeral parlor for her fiancé, she never once suspected that he would be the one to shoot her through the heart. "Millie, no, stay with me, please," Max tearfully begged as he rushed to his dying fiancé's aid. By then, Mr. Blitzo emerged from his office to see Millie die in her distraught fiancé's arms. "Millie, no, Millie!" Max wailed in agony when Millie took her final breath. Fresh tears spilled from Mr. Blitzo's eyes as rage began to fill him. He grabbed a spare container of embalming fluid from his desk and made his way back to the morgue area. Ever since they brought this John Doe into their small funeral parlor, bad things kept happening. Mr. Fizzarolli quitting, Looney's death, the storm, his fight with Max, and now Millie. Mr. Blitzo figured that it had all been the fault of this mysterious corpse. So he decided that he would forget about the autopsy and cremate the corpse himself, since the cremation oven was currently preoccupied by the corpse of his dog. Mr. Blitzo decided to coat the body of the John Doe with the highly flammable formaldehyde before retrieving his lighter from his coat pocket. "Rotten hell, you son of a bitch!" Mr. Blitzo growled before switching open his lighter and tossing it onto the corpse, causing it to burst into an unholy eruption of flames that soon licked the ceiling with a fury. "Max!" Mr. Blitzo cried out for the aid of his former employee as he fell onto his rear. He clearly did not expect the flames to get this out of control, as the growing fire practically cornered him. Final chapter, Hunted. Fabian's wife, Villa, was the next to confront me, in a blind rage, demanding the whereabouts of her 2 daughters. I took my time with her, since she was the one who took Fabian away from me, to begin with. She brought that lying brat into this world. Yes, that is what I meant by that statement. I used the powers I had to move the earth that were granted to me by my new shadow to bury her alive. To slowly suffocate her within the very dirt she was made out of. I wanted her to suffer the most. I cooked her into a stew that I, of course, shared with Fabian. Only this time I left a note from myself with love instead of the church. In hindsight, that was probably the foolish idea that led to my inevitable downfall. As Max used the fire extinguisher to put out the flames, both he and Mr. Blitzo were surprised to see that the body Mr. Blitzo had attempted to burn was completely unharmed by the fire, as it now lied on what was left of the melted steel table. "Impossible," Mr. Blitzo mumbled in disbelief as Max somberly shook his head before leaving to be with the body of his fiancée for just a few more moments. "What are you, some kind of alien?" Mr. Blitzo remarked to the corpse before grabbing his scalpel from the table of medical tools. When Mr. Blitzo brushed back the corpse's soft brown hair, he was alarmed to see a bullet wound in the center of his forehead. "You seem like a fighter, but I guess we know what finally did you in," Mr. Blitzo chuckled before using his scalpel to slice the skin away from the top of the body's skull. He then placed the scalpel back onto the medical table before then grabbing a small bone saw and beginning to saw away at the top of the body's head, soon exposing the John Doe's brain. "I admit I was a fool for not being more suspicious when Fabian invited me on another hunting trip. It'll be just like old times," he promised, and he had even apologized for his prior treatment of me, for not believing his best friend, his brother, Fabian always knew the right words to use in order to wrap me around his little finger. He even brought me some food in return as an apology, which thankfully had not been poisoned. Even though I should have been more wary of it, the hunting trip went as normal, aside from the fact that Fabian had invited 2 other men to accompany us. I did not care for this unwelcomed intrusion, but I said nothing out of fear of damaging my chances of rebuilding a friendship with Fabian. Oh, how I wish I had been more cautious, more paranoid. Holy crap on a stick! Mr. Blitzo gasped after reviewing the results of the tests that he had taken of the John Doe's brain tissue. He's still alive. Ow. Not only had Mr. Blitzo discovered a paralyzing... I just pulled my leg, I'm sorry. Discovered a paralyzing agent within the corpse's blood, but he had also discovered that the John Doe's brain tissue was still somehow active. Mr. Blitzo was quick to put all of the John Doe's organs back into his body before pulling the severed skin back together the best he could. Mr. Blitzo covered his mouth in shock as he stared down at what he now knew to somehow be only be a paralyzed body. The John Doe's trademark smile had since vanished, and he now seemed to be glaring up at the lead mortician. Hey, buddy, sorry for kind of dissecting you alive, Mr. Blitzo began with a nervous chuckle as he anxiously began to scratch the back of his head. Look, I don't know if you're some kind of witch or something, but please, just let Max go free. He had nothing to do with any of this. Mr. Blitzo then began to beg for Max's freedom at the very least, if it had been too late to save himself. Tell me how I can help you, alright? Just let me help you, he then pleaded. The strange man had somehow been powerful enough to practically reduce his small funeral home to near shambles, so perhaps he would be capable of communicating with him somehow, and telling Mr. Blitzo how he could assist him. Mr. Blitzo then cried out in pain, falling to the floor when his wrists and ankles were suddenly shattered by an unseen force. Sir! Naturally, Max had rushed in at the sound of his boss's screams, only to find Mr. Blitzo practically convulsing, as he suffered from every single wound that his John Doe had ever suffered from, the final being the bullet wound through his brain. As Max rushed to his dying boss's aid, all the wounds that had been inflicted upon the John Doe began to miraculously heal, including the cuts that had been placed on him from the autopsy. No, sir, please. Maxie gently began to weep over his former boss's broken form. Mr. Blitzo just stared back up at him with cloudy eyes, completely unresponsive. With a soft sob, Max turned his attention back to the John Doe, only to discover that his once brown hair was now a deep shade of crimson, as were his once clouded eyes. His ears had since turned into large, fluffy, black-tipped deer-like ears that now blended in with his new red hair. Small black deer-like antlers now sprouted from his head, as his feet, hands, arms, and legs had turned completely black, with veins fading deep into his skin. Horrified, Max glanced back down at his boss, quickly taking note of how something that seemed to be burned into his boss's wrist. Quickly, Max flipped over his boss's wrist, only to closely examine the Roman numeral that had been seemingly branded onto Mr. Blitzo's wrist. Hey Max, you in there? Before Max could even register the true horror of that number branding's meaning, his thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Mr. Fizzarolli calling out to him from the front door. Yes, I need help. Everyone's dead. Max cried as he quickly rushed over to the front door and began to once again attempt to open it. Open up, Mr. Fizzarolli shouted as he attempted to open the door from the other side. I'm trying, the door's still stuck. I think there's a tree in front of it, Max yelled back at him. You have a dream, you're here to tell. It's laughable, but hey kid, what the hell? Because you're one of a kind. When Mr. Fizzarolli began to sing a hauntingly familiar tune, dread began to fill Max at the realization that he was trapped within another illusion. Just as Max was startled by the apparition of Millie roaring at him in a manner similar to that of a lion, Max let out a scream before beginning to flee back toward the embalming room, where the apparition of Mr. Blitzo would be waiting for him to roar at him as well. Max then fled back toward the parlor's lobby, stopping in front of the basement door, which had suddenly swung open by itself. Before Max could even have time to react, he was shoved down the basement stairs by the apparition of the John Doe, breaking his legs in several places on the way down before finally snapping his neck upon his final landing. As Max lay dead at the bottom of the basement stairs, another Roman numeral had burned itself into his wrist. We all spent the remainder of that night drinking and laughing. Even though I knew I was drunk, I knew something was not right. When I began to lose complete control of my body, little did I know Fabian had laced my beer with a paralyzing agent. Fabian and his two friends then spent the entire night torturing me. They all took turns. I apologize, but I'd rather not say. Fabian even taunted me by claiming that he was putting me through what I had put his daughter through. Though I was still delirious, I began to regain some of my strength. I put all of my emotions into one wail of agony as my shadow made the earth begin to quake beneath us. Fearful and uncertain of what was beginning to happen, Fabian grabbed his rifle in order to shoot me in the forehead, in some sort of vain attempt to stop me. He was too late to stop my retaliation, though, as the hunting cabin crumbled down on top of him, crushing him and his men to death. I dragged all of my victims to hell with me. Even though I became an overlord, Fabian, his family, and the two men that were with him that night became the lowest of all beings, hellhounds. The best part is that their seemingly perfect little family was split up, as they were all sent off to serve imps and succubi. I truly am sorry, but I think I'll be ending the broadcast here because I am about to cry, Alistair shamelessly admitted with a voice full of excitement in spite of the tears that threatened to spill from his large crimson eyes at any given moment. Alistair then switched on the radio station's commercials in order to stall for the next broadcast before heading towards the men's room to cry softly in peace. It was a quiet night as Husk tended to his bar at the local casino. A young woman by the name of Nifty seemed to be the casino's only participant that night. Not like Husk really seemed to care as he cleaned out one of the many glasses. It was then a naked man entered the casino and took a seat at the bar. "What can I get you?" Husk asked with a monotone voice until he looked up to see just how many injuries the naked man had been covered in. "Whoa, what happened to you?" Husk practically gasped as he dropped the glass he was cleaning from shock, causing it to shatter upon the floor. "Why, are you going to judge me just like everyone else in this rotten town does?" The stranger instantly became defensive. "No, I was just asking," Husk reassured, becoming more anxious by the minute. "I am sick and tired of everyone in this wretched town looking down their noses at me. I am a human being too, you know." The stranger snarled as he abruptly stood up from his bar stool, knocking it over in the process. Husk began to back away from the enraged man, only to become alarmed when the earth began to quake beneath him. The strange man then let out a scream of rage that soon became more of a roar as the casino's floor, walls, and ceilings began to crumble around him. It was then that the entire small town had been consumed by a sinkhole, created by the powers of Alistair Bosco's shadow. Nurse Vaggie had just finished removing all of the dead bodies from Mr. Blitzo and Mr. Fizzarolli's funeral parlor, leaving the body of Alistair Bosco for last, since his smile made her feel uneasy. The whole situation made her feel uneasy. So many people dying overnight in the same place. She figured it had to be the work of a serial killer. Nurse Vaggie took a deep breath before finally forcing herself to take Alistair's body out of the ambulance, since she did not wish to be in that building for any longer. Then she needed to. After she placed the body into the back of the ambulance to most likely be taken to a different morgue, Nurse Vaggie hopped into the driver's seat and started to drive the vehicle. You have a dream, you're here to tell. It's laughable, but hey kid, what the hell? Because you're one of a kind. The radio roared to life along with the vehicle as Nurse Vaggie began to drive back toward her hospital. Nurse Vaggie remained completely oblivious to the fact that Alistair's big toe was now beginning to twitch. The fact that she was then caught off guard with a scream when a decrepit deer had suddenly leapt onto the hood of the ambulance, causing Nurse Vaggie to fatally crash the vehicle. The end.